And so you rise again. Who you were before or how you ended up at the wall of an old Russian spaceport is a story for another time. You have been chosen by the Traveler as one of our guardians, gifted with the power to wield its light in the coming battles of a timeless war. Trust this ghost. It will guide you on your path. Only guardians have the gift of the Traveler's light, the ability to channel its energies to project its vast power into the world. Even without a firearm, a guardian is a radiant engine of destruction. While these abilities rise from within, guardians master their power in different ways. Titans understand the light as a force to hone through practice and strict discipline. Hunters roam and explore in order to learn, using dangerous methods to survive the wilds. And warlocks study the light and its inner mechanisms, confronting unfathomable mysteries in the search for transcendent might. One of the kind of confusing things about Destiny is trying to separate Destiny's lore from gameplay mechanics. Because Guardians, in terms of gameplay, you have very, very strict rules as to the way that your Guardian is outfitted. Especially when it comes to the way they use their light, what your current class is, subclass is, and this all makes sense in terms of gameplay purposes. But within the lore, Guardians tend to be a bit more flexible, a bit more free with their ability to channel the light and the ways that they channel the light. Before I get into that, though, let me really quickly talk about the ghosts. Ghosts have a kind of sad existence before they actually find their guardian. See, a finite number of ghosts was created at the moment of the burst, which means there is a finite number of guardians. That number is technically up for debate. There have been wildly different representations of how many guardians there are within the lore. In fact, I believe it's in the Tyrannicide 5 lore card that it's stated there's literally millions of guardians, but looking at the results of things like the Great Disaster, the battle versus Crota on the Moon, I have a very hard time believing that there are millions of guardians. Yes, there are millions of guardians in that there are millions of players playing this game, and as such, clearly, there's millions. In terms of lore, we've seen characters like Zavala crushed by losses of guardians in the relatively low dozens, like 3 to 4 dozen guardians either dying or not returning to the tower, and that being a crushing blow to Zavala's personal morale. So I have a hard time believing that there are millions of them, number one. Number two, every ghost has a destined guardian. See, a ghost is granted a finite, as far as I understand, finite amount of light from the moment of the burst. And in a way, that's a fuse, that's a timer that ghost has to find their destined one. They don't know exactly where their destined one is, they don't know exactly who they are, but once they find them, they just know. And until then, they need to search. And many of these ghosts have been searching for hundreds and hundreds of years across multiple planets to try to find their guardians. And unfortunately, sometimes they're just never found, or even worse, the body is destroyed. There's a very, very sad lore entry about a ghost that is about to find its guardian, and the people that are trying to help this ghost find the guardian, it knows this guardian is like right behind this wall or right behind this rubble. So people trying to help the ghost use explosives to try to move the rubble, and they obliterate the body. And because they obliterated the body, that ghost immediately knows it will never have its destined one. It will never have its guardian. That connection is foolproof. It cannot be broken. As far as we know, for the most part, There's one specific story where it seems that a ghost passed from one guardian to another, but we're not entirely sure. There's, again, we're talking back into the Reza Lazir story and how complicated that all becomes. But actually, bringing up Reza Lazir is a nice transition to talk into the Guardian classes. Hunter, Titan, Warlock. What makes all three of them different? What is the purpose of all three? And are they really as locked down as we think they are in terms of abilities and things like that? Let's start with Titans. Let's start with the big heavy boys. And I mean the big heavy boys. There is an unreal amount of strength within every Titan. It's Superman stuff. It really is. A Titan's armor weighs hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds. You'll hear quotes from random NPCs in the tower. One of them in particular is a guy who tried to try on a Titan's helmet and almost broke his neck just trying to try a helmet on. Everything about a Titan's armor is designed for them to be able to defend well, build up momentum, and punch things really, really freaking hard, and they're really good at that. It's really cool to look into specifically the armors and the design of the armors of Titans and all of the Guardians when it comes down to it, because really it is the armor and the augments within the armor that help decide the abilities of each individual Guardian, almost more so than just their initial decision to choose that class as their class. It also, of course, comes down to personality. Titans are truly the soldiers of humanity. If there were any group that acts like a more traditional military structure amongst the Guardians, it's absolutely the Titans. They are the true soldiers and defenders of humanity. They're the, closest thing to a modern military soldier, just with basically power armor and explosive light abilities that you could get. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, though, you have the Warlocks, who pretty much wear no armor. It is cloth. They are literally wearing cloth, and it augments them through specific fiber weaves and all this crazy tech to truly master their light. If Titans are explosives, Warlocks are scalpels, who are sometimes also armed with explosives. In fact, pretty often they are. But they are scalpels in as much as their understanding and control over the light. There's a really cool armor description for a pair of Warlock Gloves, which explains that when concentrating and using the actual technology within those gloves, a Warlock has the capability of plucking a single atom from a molecule at will. Their control over light is so complex and so exacting, to the point that they literally have the ability to disintegrate their enemies with a touch, not with a giant built-up punch or anything, but literally I go, and that enemy will disintegrate into the void. I love playing as my Warlock. I'm a Warlock main, and digging into how a Warlock thinks about their light, what their armor does. And again, they defend themselves purely with light. They don't really have armor. That's why when it comes to the stats in the game, recovery is paramount to a Warlock build. And in lore, it's kind of the same way. They heal themselves and defend themselves completely through the usage of the light and mastery of light to reconstruct themselves at a molecular level. And then somewhere in the middle, you find Hunters. And Hunters have this kind of mix between the two armor types of Titans and Warlocks. I'm not trying to say that Titans are like heavy armor and Warlocks are light armor, which means Hunters are medium armor, but that's kind of the easiest way to think about it. Hunters are creative. They're curious. They want to scout. They want to explore. They want to find things that other groups in the tower haven't found yet, and reach out and explore places that no one has yet been to. In fact, as far as I remember, the first group to go truly outside of the city and start to try to scout areas like the Cosmodrome was a group of hunters called the Six Coyotes. Hunters may be able to wield their light in the most creative way of any of the classes, because when a hunter manifests its light, typically that's in the form of actual weapons. You'll see the golden gun, you'll see blades, you'll see a staff. It is grounded, but it's imaginative, which I find really, really fun. And you don't really have nearly as much of a representation of weapons of light when it comes to the Titans or the Warlocks. The Warlocks have a sword and Titans have a shield, but Hunters, all of their subclasses and all of their major light abilities center around the usage of actual physical manifestations of the light as weapons, which I've always found really interesting, because on one hand, I feel like it almost pigeonholes Hunters, but on the other hand, it also allows them a kind of creative freedom. You know, it's weird. The thing with all of this, though, is that it still needs to be kept in mind that the differences between how Guardians wield their light in the lore and how Guardians wield their light in the game is slightly different. Everything within the game needs to be structured and straightforward for gameplay purposes and gameplay balance purposes. But in terms of the actual lore, you're pretty likely to find Guardians that are able to not only use the abilities of other classes to a degree, but switch exactly which kind of light they are using on a whim. The idea that I have to focus as a Warlock and spend time to go, okay, I want to use solar abilities, and that would lock me to only using solar abilities while out in the field and out on an actual mission. That's not the way it works in actual lore. If you can use the light and you're powerful enough at using the light, you can basically use any ability you could imagine. That means, technically speaking, yes, a Warlock would be able to use a Hunter's golden gun, or a Hunter would be able to use a Titan's shield, or things like that. There's a few instances of Guardians who have tread across multiple classes, which Reza Lazir, bringing him up again, is one of the main examples of. So you have to bear in mind that there is a degree of separation between the representation in the game and the representation in lore of exactly what Guardians can and cannot do. It makes things confusing at times, to be certain. It makes things... How do I put this? It can be frustrating to try to decipher between the two. It can be aggravating to see things that you don't think certain subclasses or certain characters should be capable of, and they can kind of get out of a situation because of something they can suddenly do that you weren't expecting. Or it can come across that Guardians actually seem a bit weaker than you would expect, which is another separation you have to do in your mind for gameplay purposes versus lore purposes. You'll find individual Guardians in lore, and I'm not talking random Guardians, I'm talking Guardians we know are powerful, characters like Sloane, the second in command to Zavala himself in terms of the Titans, struggling against what we would in gameplay terms consider a relatively paltry Force of Fallen, but that Force of Fallen are giving Sloane a very hard time in a firefight. A 4-on-1 is a 4-on-1, for example. Like, don't get me wrong, a Titan might be able to slam the ground and get rid of a bunch of Fallen in a single blow. We've seen it multiple times in the lore. But in a firefight, gunplay is gunplay, and being held down by massive amounts of enemy fire is as much of a problem as it would be for anyone else. Because ghosts are not invincible. In fact, they're far from invincible. They seem much stronger in the game in that you can literally, when a ghost is floating in midair, shoot it as many times as you want and nothing will happen to it. But we've seen a ghost die. We've seen Sundance, who is hiding right above my head right now, actually, technically. We've seen Sundance die to a specially designed round out of a sniper rifle that was designed basically to specifically kill a ghost. But we also know that the Cabal Phalanx, for example, has enough physical strength that if it were to get hold of a ghost, it could just crush it and kill it. Ghosts are not invincible. Guardians are not invincible. We are powerful. We have the ability to be revived. We have amazing augmentations, and the light gives us incredible offensive and defensive capabilities. But Guardians aren't as numerous as some things would make you believe, and they are not as invincible as some things would make you believe. And if you don't believe that, go ask Eris Morn. Go ask Osiris. Go ask a Guardian who has lost their ghost, because a Guardian with no ghost is no longer a Guardian. They are, for all intents and purposes, once again human. So that's going to wrap things up here. It's a bit of a shorter episode, but I wanted to go into a few things specifically about Guardians to remove, hopefully, some confusion that you may have if you're trying to read lore as opposed to understand just how Guardians work within the game and the separations between the two, yada yada. Next time, I'm hoping to go into the Awoken. One of my favorite stories in all of Destiny is the Awoken origin story, and they really are kind of a standout amongst the forces of good and the forces of the Guardians and the Reef in the overall Destiny story. After all, they're blue humans. How did blue humans come to be? That's what we'll get into next time. I don't like doing this spiel, but everyone knows this spiel by now. Thank you very much for watching. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your support of this series. Would really appreciate liking this video and subscribing to the channel. You guys have been awesome with your support so far, and I really look forward to continuing this series. Thank you guys again. That's all I can possibly say. This has been Scan at GLHF TV.